mentioned, Professor Garcia Hernandez will answer questions and sign copies of his book, which is available to purchase outside in the hallway. So please join me in welcoming Professor, legal scholar, and author César García Hernández.
That's yeah. Thank you very much for that introduction, Liz. Thank you, Lisa, Rebecca, as well. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to get to return to DU. I want to thank the Center for Immigration Policy and Research. And I want to thank all of you who are making time out of your afternoon to join me. And I want to be especially thoughtful of the work that Miguel has done and did to make sure that this event went off without a hitch, and very much appreciate that. As I was heading over here today, it occurred to me that DU is actually, like, after today, DU is the only place where I have actually spoken about all three of my books. And so it has a very special place in my heart and in my career. And so I am very much appreciative of the invitation from SIPR to join you all tonight. This is an institution that, at least in my experience, has been very welcoming of folks who are interested in challenging some of the norms and the expectations about the way in which we operate in the United States, and certainly within this building, the law school building has always been, at least in my experience, a place in which it is encouraged to think critically and think creatively about the way that the law operates and the way that the law ought to operate. And that's why I think this is a book that fits in really neatly into that trajectory that the University of Denver has fostered, because this is a book. Yes, it's a book about migrants, to be sure, but it's not a book about migrants in the way that politicians so often imagine them and describe them. We hear politicians. We heard just today, in fact, from President Biden and President Trump and visiting the Texas border. We hear on the one hand from the right, politicians who describe migrants as coming to the United States to take advantage of our largesse, as coming to the United States to spread mayhem, to engage in violence and in crime. And then we hear a lot of times from liberal politicians, migrants described almost as victims. And sometimes, in fact, that word is used. Victims, maybe it's a victims of these economic forces that are greater than any of us, that are beyond the control of any single individual. Maybe it's victims of criminal smugglers. Maybe it's the victims of gangs or of traffickers. And Welcome the Wretched is, instead of adopting these facile visions of what migrants are and who migrants are, instead, I think what I tried to do in the book is describe migrants as they actually exist. And that includes all of their complexities, but it also includes their contradictions. And this is why I put at the heart of the book this notion of the criminal alien, this idea that politicians try to make real of a migrant who is defined by their failures, who's defined by their imperfections. And rather than shy away from that, rather than pretend that does not exist, Welcome the Wretched really focuses in on the fact that migrants are imperfect. They are ordinary people. And because they are just ordinary people, they will fail. they do fail, and they have always failed, and that's not changing so long as humanity doesn't change. And so, Welcome to Wretched is a book about migrants, just as it's also a book about the law. But it's not a book about the law in the way that lawyers and judges so often mythologize it, as if the law was this power that's neutral and that's detached from the people who dare to move across borders. Instead, Welcome to Wretched is a book about the law as it actually plays out in the lives of those people who it touches most directly and most concretely. And this is why it's a book about people like my dear friend Patty. Now, Patty is somebody who has devoted most of the last 2 decades to working with high school students in a New York City public school. She's a Brooklyn social. She's a social worker in Brooklyn. And Patty is somebody whose career choices have clearly evidenced the fact that she's committed not only to serving young people, but to helping them navigate this crazy world that they and that we all live in. She's also somebody who's accomplished a lot academically. Right? She has two Ivy League degrees. Right? But Patty's also somebody whose life in the United States begins in a moment of criminality. Because decades before Patty became a social worker, decades before I met Patty as college students, she was just a little girl who one late afternoon, headed to the dusty hills east of Tijuana with her mom. And in a group of other migrants, they stood out in those dusty hills waiting for the sun to set, waiting for darkness to arrive. And once it did, Patty's mom, Doña Francis, grabbed Patty's hand in her own, and the two started walking north. They started walking in the direction of the United States, and eventually they crossed that international boundary. And shortly after they did, someone in the group that they were with, someone who they don't know, someone whose identity they never figured out, yelled that dreaded but common word, migra. Immigration, border patrol agents were approaching. And as soon as that word was yelled, Patty and her mom did exactly what everyone else in the group did. They started running. And at that moment, Patty's mom lost sight of her. She had no idea where her little girl had gone in the chaos of that the darkness in the desert that night. And so, when I was talking to Patty and to her mom, to Doña Francis, about this event, almost 4 decades later, and I asked Doña Francis, what was that like? What did it feel like that evening in the desert? And she could hardly tell me the basic facts of what had happened, because she was crying and she was overcome with the emotion that she had experienced 4 decades ago. At this point, by the time I'm talking to her, her little girl is a fully grown adult, in her mid-40s. Her little girl has gone on to achieve academic success, launch and develop her professional career and her life in New York City. And yet, when I asked that question of Doña Francis about that evening 4 decades ago, she basically froze with emotion out of fear that she would not see her daughter again. And so I turned then to Patty and I said, Patty, well, what were you thinking in that moment? And Patty did not tell me anything about the Border Patrol agents. Patty didn't tell me anything about the fact that she and her mom had just violated federal law. They had just committed a crime, in fact. Because entering the United States without the government's permission, it's a federal crime. And it has been since 1929. Instead, what Patty told me that she was thinking about was her shoe. She was thinking about her shoe because the moment that she started running, she ran into a mud pit. She ran into some mud, and the mud was so thick that it grabbed onto her shoe, grabbed onto her foot. And as she kept moving forward, the mud held onto the shoe. And Patty was worried that her mom was going to be mad because somehow she had managed to lose a shoe that was literally tied to her foot. So she wasn't worried about federal law. She wasn't worried about federal law enforcement agents. She was worried about the most important person in her life and what she was going to think. And so Patty, a little while later, gets caught by the Border Patrol agents. And she doesn't know it, but her mom is also apprehended, and her mom doesn't know that Patty's been caught either. So a little while later, Border Patrol agents bring Patty into a holding cell inside of a nearby Border Patrol station. And in the corner, she sees her mom sitting there shaking uncontrollably, crying loudly. And she says to me, "That's the moment when I realized I wasn't in trouble." Because that is the thing that was most important to her. The thing is, Patty's life in the United States begins in that experience. But it doesn't end there, because that night they get deported, and a few days later, they once again head to those dusty hills east of Tijuana, and they wait for the darkness to settle, and once it does, they start walking north. And eventually they make their way to the Central Valley of California, where the life that Patty's mom dreamed of for her little girl finally begins. And where Patty's future launches, where it begins to blossom. But none of that would have happened had Doña Francis not decided that she was going to try to get to the Central Valley no matter what it took, including committing a crime, including becoming the criminal aliens who are at the heart of my book. And that's why I celebrate Patty. And I celebrate the decision that Patty's mom makes. Because had she not done that, she would never have entered my life. And more importantly, she would not have entered the lives of those almost 20 years worth of New York City public high school students. Now, Patty would have been helped by the fact that she was so young, but not so much her mom. Because not only did she commit the crime of illegal entry into the United States, once they got deported and they came back, again without the government's permission, she committed a second crime called illegal re-entry, which is basically the same thing, only coming back after having previously been deported. That's felony punishable by up to 2 years of imprisonment. And these days, when we're listening to the Attorney General of the state of Texas attacking a nonprofit in El Paso called Association House that has been since the 1970s helping migrants who reach El Paso by providing them with a place to stay, with some food, with some guidance. And the Attorney General is saying, you are smuggling people into the United States in violation of the law. Then if that organization is doing that, well, then so was Patty's mom. So these days, we might say that Patty's mom was also smuggling a little girl into the United States. And so, Welcome the Wretched is about people like my friend Patty. It's also about people like a man named Louis Loftus Repoulier, a man who was born in the Dutch West Indies and moved to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, who lived in a time when the law was more forgiving, even if the people were in no less need of being forgiven. And so, Louis Loftus Repoulier, he moves to New York City. And there he starts to raise a family. And to do that, he's working at a nearby hospital as an elevator operator. Most of his life, he's a fairly unremarkable human being. Goes to work, comes home. has some friends. But one afternoon, in October of 1939, he does something that is so remarkable that I chose to begin one chapter in the book, a chapter called Illegal Isn't Illegal, with his story. So I want to share a little bit about Louis Loftus-Rapullier and why it is that his story is so important to understanding the way that immigration law has changed. One afternoon, in October 1939, in the sliver of New York City, where Manhattan stretches north alongside the Bronx, Louis Loftus-Rapullier sat motionless on his son's bed. The 13-year-old boy's face was still covered by a rag when a neighbor climbed through a window into the Rapullier family's apartment. His body, limp and warm, was stretched on the bed. Earlier that day, Louis had called in sick to his job as an elevator operator at nearby Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. He waited until his wife and daughter had gone shopping, then sent the couple's other 2 children to a movie. Only the oldest child, Raymond, was left. Always frail, Raymond became his father's target. Louis soaked a rag with chloroform, the New York Times reported, and applied it several times to the boy's face. We don't know whether the father hesitated or the son struggled, but by the time the police arrived, there was no question what had happened. Louis had killed his son. When word spread of his arrest, Louis's co-workers at the hospital collected money to pay the court-ordered bail. Talking to the jurors just before asking them to convict the father, the prosecutor acknowledged a soft spot for the man charged with killing a child. I find it quite difficult to approach the issue in this case when our minds are practically engulfed in the mountain tide of sympathy, the prosecutor said. He meant sympathy for Louis. Soon a jury would convict him of manslaughter, but along with a conviction, the jury asked the judge to show utmost clemency. Despite having killed his own son, Rapullier commanded so much sympathy because his son was ill. It's unclear what health problems Raymond had. News reports used dated language suggesting neurological problems that also prevented him from moving around. He was just like dead all the time, Rapullier told detectives. Whatever was going on with Raymond's body and mind, his father's decision was treated as a form of loving mercy. From his friends to the prosecutor, everyone seemed to agree that it was better, or at least understandable, to kill the boy than allow him to continue suffering. Raymond's killing aside, Louis was considered a devoted parent, the judge at Louis's criminal trial said, even as he announced Louis's sentence. There was no irony. It was possible to kill one child, but be a loving parent to the others. Well, less than 7 years after that dreadful fall afternoon, Louis would become the newest citizen of the United States. A white man born in the Dutch West Indies, Louis had arrived in his adopted country in 1917. Eventually, a court would unravel Louis's claim to citizenship, but not because he killed Raymond. The pitiable event, now long past, will not prevent Rapullier from taking his place among us as a citizen, explained Judge Billings' learned hand, one of the most influential judges in the history of the United States. Instead, the court overturned Louis's naturalization for the most technical reason. He hadn't waited long enough to apply. Back then, federal law required 5 years of good moral character before applying for citizenship after the conviction, and Louis had waited 4 years, 11 months, and 1 week. Had he just held off applying for another 3 weeks, he would have been admitted without question, Judge Learned Hand wrote. Had he just been a bit more patient, all 3 judges on the appellate court would have left his citizenship untouched. Instead, the appellate court judges revoked his citizenship, but they suggested that he start over. That's exactly what Louis did. In the meantime, he kept living in the United States, going to work at the hospital, and continuing to raise his other children, like the devoted parent that the judge said he was. And on April 18, 1949, Louis became a U.S. citizen for the second and final time. Well, today, far less deviance leads to far more punishment. There's a common refrain in conversations about immigration policy that Republicans and Democrats can't agree on anything when it comes to immigration law. And welcome the wretched with examples like Louis Loftus Rapullier and like examples that are much more recent. Shows that common refrain is wrong. In the 1980s, legislators, members of Congress, working with various presidential administrations, began to radically reshape immigration law. They began to leave behind the world in which citizenship could follow death, the world in which Louis Loftus Rapullier could be welcomed into the citizenry, and his children and their children's children could continue being citizens of the United States. For these imperfect people, the law was willing to welcome them into citizenship despite their illegality. Well, not so much anymore. Across about 10 years, stretching from the middle of the 1980s to the middle of the 1990s, Congress made it easier to fall into the immigration, prison, and deportation pipeline, and harder to get out. Instead of seeing migrants as the whole, complicated people who they are, today these laws tie migrants to their worst moments. And the thing is, if you look hard enough, you're going to find those worst moments in each of our lives. So I want to share a little bit about the worst moment that came to a woman who I spoke to when I was doing the research for this book, a woman named Winnie Goodwin. For Winnie Goodwin, the worst moment came on May 29, 1993. Passing by a restaurant in Orange County, California, she and a group of friends stopped when they saw some other kids they didn't like. Things quickly worsened. Shouting started. A gun came out. Shots were fired. 2 girls ended up in the hospital. I unlawfully attempted to kill Nyung Lu and Sethong Trungpachan with malice aforethought, Winnie wrote on the guilty plea form she signed and submitted to the court. The police say that Winnie was in a gang, and on the plea form she agreed, but looking back on it, Winnie says that's overblown. It was just a bunch of teenagers that had no positive influence, she told me. As children, we came together to be part of something because I didn't fit in anywhere. There's nothing unusual about Winnie's teenage years. Gangs certainly weren't new to Southern California in the late 1980s and early 1990s, but they were becoming more common. More important than what was happening on the streets of Orange County was what was happening in Washington. Winnie's teenage years coincided with a period when Republicans and Democrats were going after each other as being weak on crime. The year that Winnie arrived in California, 1988, President Ronald Reagan announced Crime Victims Week, declaring, "The responsibility for crime lies with those who commit them." That fall, allies of Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, attacked the Democratic nominee for president, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, for his position on releasing prisoners. Describing the stabbing and the rape of a white couple by a convicted black man, Willie Horton, who had received temporary release from Massachusetts prison, Republicans orchestrated a brutal ad campaign, branding Dukakis' position as dangerous. Launched by Lee Atwater, a political operative, the TV spot added an unspoken racial element to the Democrats' dangerousness. Black men were a threat to white people. Credited with carrying Bush to the presidency, the Willie Horton ad is a lesson in the power of the media to fan fears of crime. Over and over again, TV news broadcasts flashed menacing images of Horton. A mugshot, an image of him looming over cops, a scary close-up, often pairing them with photos of white people he had attacked. Democrats learned a lesson. 4 years after the Willie Horton ad pushed Bush into the White House, the incumbent president's Democratic opponent, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, was ready to take the offensive on crime. On the campaign trail, Clinton blasted Bush as weak on crime. He's talked a lot about drugs, but he hasn't helped people on the front line to wage the war on drugs and crime, but I will, Clinton promised as he accepted his party's nomination for president. After Clinton's victory, his allies in Congress were ready to make good on that promise. Delaware Senator Joe Biden stood on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1993 to bemoan young people without any conscience developing. Speaking the same year that Winnie was arrested, Biden added, "We have predators on our streets." Biden could have been talking about Winnie. Gang or not, Winnie and her friends were up to no good that night. Decades later, she doesn't deny that. She was there in the middle of the argument when shots were fired and 2 people were hit. But fortunately, neither died. Convicted of 2 counts of attempted murder, plus a sentencing boost for gang involvement, Winnie got 12 years in the state prison system. By then, Winnie had lived in the United States for all but the first month or so of her life, and the government knew it. In fact, she'd entered as a refugee. She was born in Vietnam just before her parents fled because of the war. In those chaotic last days of the conflict, she didn't so much leave Vietnam as she was taken out. She was a newborn carried onto her family's fishing boat in her parents' arms. And the first place she saw in the United States, though she was too young to remember it, was Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. Now, Winnie is still in Orange County. But the only reason isn't because of immigration law. The only reason she's there is she was actually ordered deported. But when she finished her sentence and the government tried to deport her, they realized Vietnam wouldn't take her back. Back then, Vietnam did not have a repatriation agreement with the United States. As a result, the United States could not actually deport her to Vietnam, so having nothing else to do with her, they let her go home. They let her go to Orange County. And once back there, she did what most people do. When they grow up, she grew out of crime. And instead, she got herself a bachelor's degree, got herself a master's degree. These days, she runs an HR department for a company of about 3,000 people. She's raising a family. She's helping care for her aging parents, and she's doing it all in the United States. I use this example because we hear so often the idea from politicians that crime is brought here, that migrants bring crime to the United States. But Winnie's example is somebody who has lived in the United States her entire life minus 1 month. It's a reminder that crime is born in the United States at least as much as it's born anywhere else. And that's true of gang activity, like the kind that Winnie was accused of, as anything else. Now, when it comes to gang activity, there's one gang in particular that politicians love to talk about. It's called Mara Salvatrucha 13, MS-13. And we're told so often that this is a gang that was born in Central America and exported to the United States, helping to destabilize and victimize communities from Long Island to San Diego. The thing is, MS-13, it's actually a homegrown entity. It was actually born in LA, and it was exported to Central America in that moment, beginning in the 1980s and the 1990s, when the federal government decided to make it easier for migrants to have a run-in with the criminal legal system to end up in immigration problems. So let me share a little bit from the book about this phenomenon of trying to deport our way out of criminal activity, only to find that it becomes an immigration problem years later. In the late 1980s and 1990s, around the time Winnie Goodwin moved to California, young people fleeing wartime violence in El Salvador began organizing themselves into small groups in LA, cliques they're called in Spanish. In search of comfort and security, some eventually formed the MS-13 and got involved with the booming drug trade. Led by the Reagan administration, deportation became policymakers' chosen remedy for migrants caught up in this deadly mix. A short-sighted embrace of policing planted the seeds of instability in another round of migration decades later. The gang's rise was a misfire by U.S. officials that thought deportation could solve their problems. They thought that they were spitting out, but really they were spitting into the air above them. A pair of Central American writers, Oscar and Juan Jose Martinez, wrote, "Deported to El Salvador, while it was still struggling to rebuild after years of fighting, These youths had little to fall on except each other and little to do except tell stories of California. There was Mauricio Solano, dubbed Ozzy, in honor of heavy metal celebrity Ozzy Osbourne, who joined the clica based near LA's famous MacArthur Park. After his deportation in 1991, he became one of MS-13's first leaders. José Antonio Terán was a member of the U.S.-backed National Police in El Salvador who fled the war in which he fought. He joined MS-13 in California's San Fernando Valley. And after his deportation, he started the Hollywood Locos Salvatrucha Clica. And there's El Diablito, the little devil, who was born in San Salvador as Borromeo Enrique Solorzano, but raised in Los Angeles. There, he joined the Hollywood Locos Clica. And also deported in the 1990s, he rose through the gang's ranks, becoming such a key figure that in 2013, the U.S. Treasury froze his assets. Rooted in California and exported to El Salvador, the transnational violence that they experienced as young people in war-weary El Salvador, then in gang-torn California, helped launch a transnational menace. Despite those clear ties between the social fault lines of California a few decades ago and the violence that constantly rattles Central America today, politicians in the United States insist on more of the same. Central American gangs such as Mara Salvatrucha and 18th Street Gang largely serve as cross-border couriers, smuggling drugs and people into the United States, Biden's Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, told Congress. In his trademark viciousness, Trump described gang members as animals. Obama took a softer tone, but he also emphasized their crimes while ignoring their humanity. As sound bites, these are powerful tactics, but as policy, continuing to deport gang members, just as we have done in the past, means that the future of immigration policy is likely to look a lot like the present. And that's why, instead of continuing this pattern in which we tack on to the end of a criminal conviction the beginnings of a deportation process, in which we add to the end of the punishments for engaging in criminal activity the beginnings of a punishment for violating immigration law, instead of adding a second layer of punishment to activity that has already been punished, I instead propose, inspired by that radical reimagining of immigration law that stretched from the 1980s through the 1990s, I instead propose a radical reimagining of the law of citizenship. A reimagining of citizenship law that leaves behind that history of limiting citizenship based on differing, changing, but always repugnant markers of who's unfit for full participation in the life of our political community. Most of us are familiar with the fact that for much of the nation's history we used racial restrictions on access to citizenship. But it actually wasn't until the middle of the 20th century, well after the Civil War, well after the enactment, the ratification of the 14th Amendment, that we removed the last of those racial restrictions from citizenship law. Less well known is the fact that up until the early parts of the 20th century, women could not fully possess their own citizenship independent of their fathers or independent of their husbands. And so I propose that we leave behind those attempts to categorize whole people as unfit for citizenship, but that we also leave behind the present-day law of citizenship that is itself anchored in the past. Anchored in that moment where we first saw the light of day, in that place where our mothers happened to be located at the moment of our birth. And instead, I propose that we embrace a version of citizenship that reflects the citizenry as it is and as it has been, not as we wish that it was. Not some romanticized version that we can sing about, that we can write poetry about, as we can write novels about people who simply pulled themselves up by their bootstraps as if no one else was helping them. But instead, a version of that motley crew of humanity, of imperfect, fallible human beings that the citizenry has always been. And it's that version of citizenship, of the citizenry as this group of imperfect human beings, that leads me to end the book and end my remarks today by talking about Robert E. Lee. That Robert E. Lee. The one whose claim to fame is to lead the military insurrection, whose objective it was the literal destruction of the United States of America. And for all his military genius and for all the Confederacy's military prowess, ultimately they failed in their goal. But they failed only after taking the lives of 750,000 people. Now, Robert E. Lee is a high-ranking official in the Confederate States of America, like so many other high-ranking officials who aligned themselves with the Confederacy, disowned the United States of America and disowned the citizenship that he had previously possessed. But then, when he surrenders famously to Ulysses S. Grant on the battlefield in Appomattox in Virginia, the country to which he has pledged allegiance no longer exists. And at that moment, Robert E. Lee is left stateless, as are other high-ranking members of the Confederacy. And as part of the surrender agreement, Ulysses Grant actually pardons a lot of the foot soldiers, a lot of the low-ranking soldiers, the troops, for having engaged in this insurrection against the United States. And over the course of the next few months, Andrew Johnson, who becomes president after Lincoln is assassinated, begins issuing a series of pardons aimed at some of those higher-ranking officials. And that's why I want to read a little bit about Robert E. Lee's situation and why I think it's relevant to these conversations about citizenship today. Now, despite multiple amnesties that eventually included almost everyone who sided with the South, there was one major exception lingering: Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Indicted for treason, he was fortunate to avoid prosecution for any wartime crimes. After famously surrendering to Grant in 1865, Lee sought forgiveness. In June of 1865, about 2 months after laying down arms, Lee sent President Johnson a written pardon request. A few months later, Lee signed an amnesty oath, pledging allegiance to the country he tried to destroy and the Constitution he so violently ignored. But Johnson did not sign off. It appears he may never have even received Lee's plea. In 1970, a State Department archivist found Lee's amnesty request in some old files. 105 years after Lee's death in 1870, President Gerald Ford erased the last legal disability on the secessionist leader's life. Now, on the House floor, Virginia Congressman Caldwell Butler asked, if Robert E. Lee is not worthy to be a U.S. citizen, then who is? Well, Winnie Goodwin is. My friend Patty is. Even Louis Loftus-Propoulier is. As are all those individuals who are born into the citizenship of another country and whose failures don't rise to the level of 750,000 people, whose critical acclaim is not the literal destruction of the United States of America, or the attempt to literally destroy the United States of America. And so instead of asking the question that Caldwell Butler asks, if Robert E. Lee is not worthy to be a U.S. citizen, then who is? I like to think if Robert E. Lee is fit to be a U.S. citizen, then who is not? Well, surely not those of us whose lives are much more ordinary, whose days are mostly mundane, whose hours are mostly unremarkable, and whose failures are inevitable, but don't rise to the level of being memorialized in the history books in the way that Robert Lee Lees does. And that's why the version of citizenship that I espouse and that I propose in the last few chapters of the book is one that reflects the citizenry not as we romanticize it, not as we sometimes remember it, but as it has been, because it's very much the same today. We continue to be a nation of misfits, of scoundrels, of people who rise to their finest occasion when the moment calls for it, but who also suffer from the fallibility and an imperfection that goes along with our humanity, not because of where we were born or where we claim citizenship, but simply because we are ordinary people, and we always will be. Thank you very much. So there's time for questions. I'm happy. Yes.
You talk a little bit in your book about like things that Congress could get rid of, like agreements that allow ICE and police departments to be in contact and other things. But when Congress, in a time when Congress can't seem to do much, how do you remain hopeful, and how can, I guess, local governments do things to take steps to protect migrants?
Yeah, look, I didn't write this book for this Congress, right? I didn't write this book for this particular political moment, and I don't think you do, right? I don't think you imagine a set of laws that departs as much from what we're doing as what I am proposing, hopeful that it's going to become legislation in the next 6 months or even the next 6 years. And I say this pretty explicitly in the closing pages. You know, this is an idea that I hope is the beginnings of a much larger shift, right? Inspired very much by that radical restructuring of immigration law 40 years ago. You know, I don't know what immigration law and citizenship law is going to look like 40 years from now. I'm certain that somebody is injecting their vision of justice into trying to hash out what it should look like, and I'm afraid that I'm not going to like that particular vision of justice, so I might as well put forth the version that I like, right? And that's what this is intended to be, sort of a basic infrastructure, a basic blueprint for daring to reimagine, right? Daring to take a step back from the then-end political debates that we hear, political conversations that we hear, political complaints that we hear so often coming from Washington, and think, you know, what we're doing now has led us to where we are now. And if we only do more of what we're doing now, we hire more Border Patrol agents, if we hire more ICE officers, if we pay for more immigration prison beds, if we pay for more advanced digital surveillance technologies at the border, then none of us should be surprised that in a few years, we're going to be in exactly the same place we are now, right? And so I'm very much hope that, you know, this is a book for the medium and long term rather than a book for the short term. That said, what can local governments do? I think local governments can do a lot, and I think during the Trump years we saw local governments and states, to some extent some state governments, you know, really looking closely at their criminal legal system, and asking to what extent is their criminal legal system actually promoting public safety, and part of that calculation was the role that immigration and customs enforcement officers, that immigration officers had in being involved with tapping the criminal legal system as the starting point, as a sort of a net that begins the capture process that then puts people into the immigration, prison, and deportation pipeline. And I think what we've seen is that ICE and the Border Patrol have been ingenious in skirting and circumventing a lot of those laws. I write about their reliance on companies like LexisNexis, which many of you are familiar with, I'm sure rely on for your own research, right? They rely on LexisNexis to help identify people who might be deportable. They rely on contracts with Palantir, which is headquartered here in Denver, downtown, to tap enormous digital databases that Palantir sells access to, and that helps them identify specific people who might be deportable and figure out where they're located so that they can actually apprehend them, right? These are responses to those Trump years efforts by local governments and state governments to say, look, we don't want to hand over our people, our residents, to ICE, almost sometimes regardless of what they've done, right? Or we don't want to have ICE tap our information, the information that we gather about our residents. And so DHS, through ICE and the Border Patrol, basically said, look, well, if you're not going to give it to us, we'll go around you, we'll buy it. And, Congress, they have a wonderful benefactor in Congress that's willing to give them enormous quantities of money to do that. And so I think legislators at the state and local level have to continuously return to those laws that they enacted. The motivations for those laws are still there, even if there's a Democrat in the White House, and continue to ask, are we still protecting our neighbors? Are we still welcoming our neighbors? And is there more that can be done? And there's always more that states and cities can do.
Question?
Just like based on like the example you gave of like the guy from the West Indies in the early 20th century and like the specific choice to end about the Robert E. Lee example, I was gonna ask about like how like the role of like archival research kind of played a role in your development of the book and this thought process.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah. So I spent a good amount of time in doing some archival research. Actually, there's a different guy who I didn't talk about, a guy named Coleman Blease, who was a politician in South Carolina, but one of the chapters is focused entirely on the origins of the legal entry and legal reentry laws. And so I spent a lot of time in one of in the South Carolina archives, looking at his stuff. For Louis Loftus Repollier, I actually spent a lot of time using the Freedom of Information Act, which is the federal government's Information Transparency Act, to try to get his old immigration records, because some of those proved to be really important to understand exactly what it is, why it is that the government had questioned his citizenship, and how it is that the courts had decided that he ought to be welcomed into the citizenry despite his convictions. Yeah.
I had a quick question about rhetoric and the rhetoric used around immigration. In the title of your book, you use the word criminal alien, and I was wondering in what direction you see rhetoric around immigration going. Do you see there being a reclaiming of the term illegal and of these somewhat derogatory uses of immigration, or do you see a pivot away from it altogether?
Yeah, look, I use the phrase criminal alien. I also use the phrase wretched, right, in the title. I'm really trying to highlight the fact that there's some of that in all of us, right? And the entire thrust of the book is to walk toward that, right? To walk toward those imperfections and to walk toward those people precisely because they are ordinary human beings, and part of that means they are going to fail. They have failed, and we can find evidence of that. And some of those failures might be hurtful. Some of those failures might be criminal, right? And as a result, I try not to distance myself from the language that is so often wielded against migrants, right? To bludgeon them precisely because they are imperfect people. I don't know whether the phrase criminal alien will or should be embraced, right? It certainly is a complicated term. The wretched as well. My goal is simply to complicate those terms so that we don't, and the rhetoric around immigration policy, so that it's not possible for politicians to simply sort of paint a migrant as being nothing more than their worst moment, instead recognizing that, yeah, they have their worst moments. You look around, you look hard enough, you're going to find those worst moments, but that's not because of their citizenship, that's just because they're ordinary people. Yes?
Today in one of my classes we talked about the lobbying that the many corporations have had in the prison industrial complex, and how a lot of labor is done through private prisons. And I know that the groups like ALEC and other lobbying groups have had a hand in creating the immigration prison industrial complex. And so could you maybe talk about that a little bit, and then also the I guess corporate stakes in that, in the immigration prison industrial complex?
Yeah, so there's various parts of this, right? Because there's the private prison companies like CoreCivic, which used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, Geo Group, which runs the facility in Aurora, and then there's sort of the entities that aren't directly involved in imprisoning people. They don't actually operate brick and mortar detention facilities, but they make it possible, right, for ICE to find those folks who are going to be sent into those places. And that includes companies like LexisNexis, includes Palantir, those companies that I mentioned. And those companies, they're not engaged in a social service, right? They're not partnering with the Department of Homeland Security simply because they are aligned ideologically. And I think with some, like Palantir in particular, there is an ideological alignment between the founder and the CEO and the Trump administration in particular. But I think that's the exception. Mostly they're aligned, they're partnering with DHS because it's in their financial interest to do so. And as a result, they rely very heavily on the contracts that they get from DHS. And so long as Congress is willing to constantly increase the budget that DHS gets, then their partners are pretty secure. And these are companies, private companies, like any other private companies. They have their good years, they have their bad years, right? They have complications that cost money and difficulties hiring people and running their facilities. That's normal, right? But the consistency across the decades has now been that this is a growth industry. And it's an expansive industry. The work, the services that companies like Palantir provide to DHS did not exist 10 years ago, right? Partly that's a result of the fact that computer technology was not good enough. Partly it's a result of the fact that there was not a market for it. There's now a market for it, and it has a really outsized customer presence in the form of the Department of Homeland Security. And so long as that customer has a enormous and consistent source of funding from Congress, I can fully expect that will continue.
Any questions?
Yes.
César, thank you so much. I hear a lot of echoes of Brennan Stevenson, sort of, in what you're saying about people who are poor and the worst thing they've ever done, and I really appreciate your application of that to this context. I think that's such a powerful insight. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit sort of what, philosophical underpinnings or maybe like abolitionist literature you relied on to kind of set up the frameworks that you're using here?
Yeah, I rely on Angela Davis, certainly Mariam Kamba, but I also write about Du Bois and his work on Reconstruction. And in fact, in the very closing pages, I reference back to the very end of the massive Black Reconstruction in America, his huge sort of takedown of the Reconstruction era. In the very closing pages, he sort of stops being he stops writing about the Reconstruction period, and instead turns his attention to the scholarly community and the scholarly debate around Reconstruction. And he says, look, this is a book that is describing Black people in that period, so that bridges just before the Civil War and then Reconstruction. This is a book that describes Black people as ordinary people. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, like, I know that's gonna hurt my readership, right? And that is a ton of my motivation, right? A ton of the inspiration that I have is to just acknowledge that, the calling migrants, superheroes, exceptional, dreamers, it has a purpose. It has a particular political purpose, and it certainly feels good to do that emotionally. But as a framework for promoting policy that welcomes migrants, it's hugely problematic because it is so limiting. Because not very many of us can cross the threshold to being exceptional, right? To being superhuman, and so for me, Du Bois is the way that he's engaging the academic community that he's a part of in the early 20th century is, I think, it's a very strong source of my own inspiration, right? And I say that with some hesitation because I'm definitely not trying to compare myself to Du Bois. But I am to answer your question, right? I think like his framing of the ordinariness of people, and also his willingness to acknowledge that is going against the grain of the dominant discourse, the dominant rhetoric around this topic, is something that I find very powerful, and also is very appropriate as a way of reframing conversations around migration. Yes?
I have a problem on an ongoing basis trying to reconcile what it means when we hear politicians like Donald Trump talk about immigrants poisoning the blood of our country and that they're vermin and so on and so forth, with the compassion that seems to be inherent in your stories that you've shared. How do we begin to reconcile that with politicians who don't seem to have any concern about integrating humanity into policy?
I don't think we do. Politics isn't necessarily about reconciliation. Politics is often just about who has the power to make laws, right? Who has the power to control appropriations? Who has the power to enforce the law? And as a result, I think one tactic is to try to change hearts and minds. Right? Good luck changing Donald Trump's heart and mind. For all of his supporters who cheered on his separating of families and tearing children away from their parents, you need an artist. You need a priest. You need a poet, maybe, right? To change those hearts and change those minds, right? The social science literature tells you what you need is you need to expose them to migrants, right? You need to have some migrants move into their neighborhoods, into their communities. Okay, fine. I get all. I'm familiar with that literature. That's great. People are going to move to those communities and slowly over the course of decades or generations expose some folks who don't currently have much exposure to migrants, and as a result, they're very reluctant to live in a country that has migrants. Fine. That's a very slow-moving evolution. While that's happening, I prefer to just focus on the political power component of this. Right? And part of the inspiration for this is something that I wrote about in my last book, Migrating to Prison, which is about an evolution in the middle of the 20th century with regard to the detention of migrants. So in the early parts of the 20th century, the federal government builds up immigration detention centers in various parts around the country, including Ellis Island, Angel Island, and San Francisco Bay. And then in 1954, Eisenhower is a Republican. He's in the White House. He's the president. And his attorney general, a guy by the name of Herbert Brownell, goes to a naturalization ceremony at Ebbets Field, which is the home of the Brooklyn Dodgers at the time. And he says, look, we're going to stop detaining people. And that doesn't actually turn out to be completely true. They keep open a bunch of sort of short-term facilities for Mexicans in particular along the Southwest. But they do close a bunch of the bigger facilities, including some of the more symbolically important ones, like the one on Ellis Island. And the reason they do that isn't because one day Dwight Eisenhower or his attorney general just woke up and said, oh, you know what, that was just a bad idea. We shouldn't do that. No. The reason for that was politics. What was happening in 1954 was that the Soviet Union was starting to rebuild from the beating it had taken during World War II. The Cold War had started, and they were looking for allies. And they were going around the world, and they were saying, look at how the United States treats your friends, your neighbors, your family members, your fellow citizens. They lock them up. They chain them. They fence them. And then they deport them. Right? They do not think of you as an equal. Therefore, you should align with us. And Eisenhower, savvy military tactician, brilliant military tactician that he was, right? His wife's from Denver. Says, domestic immigration policy, it needs to be incorporated into our national security policy. Right? And as a result, the calculus around the detention of migrants moving forward changes. And I use that story as motivation to realize that the reason why immigration policy is what it is because of politics. Right? And politics is at bottom, it's a game of, it's a power struggle. And so changing hearts and minds, I'm not opposed to that, right? Encourage artists and clergy and poets to try to do that. I'm not any of those things. And so I want to focus on the way that we can reimagine the legal system and then think about the way that the political strategy can develop to promote the reimagined legal strategy that I'm talking about, that I'm writing about in Welcome to Wretched.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Yes.
So we know that this topic, criminalization of immigration, is you could talk about it for hours. You wrote a whole book on it. And so we have a project, and I'm going to shamelessly ask, if Prentice Martin is going to cover your ears, if you had 2 minutes to sum up what is the criminalization of immigration, what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's the increasing reliance on criminal legal authorities to treat migration as a security risk and to then respond with it with all of the tools that are in the government's arsenal to respond to threats to the community, the safety of the community. And along with that is sort of the rhetorical part that depicts migrants as being dangerous, as being threatening. And once you do that, then of course it only makes sense to have a governmental response that attacks that threat. Yeah, sorry, that was less than 2 minutes, but
That's even better.
I've talked about that before. Yeah, exactly. Good?
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
One more
well, 1.5 more announcements that there will be books outside to buy, and these are hopefully able to sign as well. And also for Sipper, we have some stickers outside, so and actually some over here too. Please grab a sticker. If you are a Toledo student or don't have a bag, there's also some bags outside, which may have a few extras as well. I'm looking at you, but there are a few extras that you would like to grab. Thank you again for
Thank you.
coming here with you again. You go first.